I'm Connor Ressler. I'm the Chesapeake Conservation Corps member here at the Department of Public Works. So the Department of Public Works helps with the construction, maintenance, and preservation of the physical city itself. So I help with the environmental side and the sustainability side. I'm here for about a one-year fellowship, doing some of this education workshop as well as outreaching to the community for environmental sustainability. And this kind of fits in nicely with that for the preservation of the city, because composting is an awesome and really personal way to keep our soils preserved here in the city. It keeps it in a closed loop, so our waste goes back into our soil and keeps it nice and local here. So that's kind of what we're doing today, is helping people understand how they can keep their waste in a closed loop by composting. Just so we can run through a bit of an outline of what's going to happen today is I'll go through this presentation, which should take between 45 minutes and about an hour, and then that has lots of opportunities for any of you guys to ask me questions, get all of those good questions answered. Before at about 11 or 11:15, I'll give a brief tour. We actually have some composting here at Public Works. We have a two-bin system out back as well as some vermiculture, which we'll learn about. So I can give you a chance to kind of see that, know about that process, ask any questions about that, and then we will go to selling the bins. So you can wait until about 11:15 and then we can start that process. So hold your questions about that. Cool. Any questions before we get started though?
Would you prefer questions during the presentation or at the end?
During is perfect. If you just want to shoot up a hand, I'll get to you as soon as I finish my thought and then I can answer your questions. All right, perfect. Would you like to click our slide? Perfect. Awesome. So I'm going to start with more of a broad-based scientific definition of what even is composting, and then I'll bring it down to a little bit more layman's terms. But it's good to start broad so we can get that kind of general understanding of what is composting. So the scientific definition is the aerobic decomposition of biodegradable organic matter. I think most of us can maybe pick apart one or two words we know in there, but that basically means that we are having an oxygenated process. It needs oxygen to work, and it's breaking down those bits of things that were pretty recently alive. So things like food and wood and plant matter is being broken down in a process that needs oxygen. Makes sense? Cool. If you could click the slide. Thanks. So just breaking that down a little bit more, the actual breaking down, the decomposition itself, is performed by facultative and obligate aerobic bacteria, yeast, and fungi, which basically means we have all these little tiny microbes that are breaking it down the process with oxygen. Facultative aerobic bacteria means that in the presence of oxygen, they will break down the organic matter, and obligate means that they absolutely need oxygen in order to break it down. So that just means that if oxygen wasn't present, some of these facultative microbes could be able to break it down, but it would take much longer or would start to smell really, really bad. So what's great is that when we have an oxygenated process, it speeds up the process and then doesn't have any of those really smelly bad things that we like. So these are called our microbes, and they are breaking it down. However, some of the decomposition of the compost also happens by some what we call our macroinvertebrates, so what I call the big bugs. So that's things like earthworms and ants, and beetles, springtails, little tiny bugs that help to break down the bigger pieces, so then they turn that into smaller pieces that then the microbes can break down even more. Questions about that? Makes sense. Do you want to click? Thank you. So even just breaking that down into a little bit more of a layman's term, what is composting? So composting is taking those plant remains and other things that were pretty recently alive and to make this dark, earthy, crumbly material that is a great soil additive. So we're taking those plants and our waste that we might normally send to the landfill, and we're allowing this process of decomposition to turn it into a really useful material that we can actually then put back into our soils. It's a great way to turn your yard and your kitchen waste into an actual valuable resource that helps preserve your soils, and then you can use it even in your own garden, your own houseplant. So it's a great way to close that loop of waste of things that were pretty recently alive and turn it into something very, very useful. Cool. You want to click? So just as the fundamentals, what you are doing as a composter is providing a good habitat and in a good healthy environment for those microbes and those macroinvertebrates, the big bugs, to do the work for you. You're providing like a good life and all the essentials of life for the worms and the ants and the microbes and the bacteria, then do the work for you. So that's, as a composter, that's the fundamental definition, is you are providing a good habitat for these worms, these bugs, these microbes. Do you want to click? So these organisms will slowly make compost like basically wherever it's going to happen, but out of our yard and kitchen waste. But your job as composters is to give them lots of those essentials of life so that they'll do it faster for you and they'll do it without making that smelly kind of waste. So just like you, these organisms will need air, water, and food. So as a composter, you're essentially providing them the air, water, and food to do their job more quickly and to do their job with less of that smelly waste. Cool. Do you want to click? So I'm just going to break down what it means as a composter to provide those 3 essentials of life for your microbes and for your big bugs. So air. Because what I talked about earlier is the aerobic process. They need air, they need oxygen to do their work. Otherwise, it's either going to happen really, really slow or it's going to smell really, really bad. So as a good composter, you want to make sure you're adding the air into the compost so the decomposition can happen quickly and without that smell. And there's a couple different ways to do this. We'll get into some of the techniques, but one of them is just to provide leaves, straw, newspaper, and cardboard in kind of a layered system because these things have a lot of air pockets to them. It's not that like dense, like if you think about like your kitchen waste or your yard waste is pretty condensed. There's not a lot of air in it. But providing these layers, we call them lasagna layers. So you're having lasagna layers of these like aerated pockets versus the non-aerated pockets will keep the whole compost system itself pretty aerated. Another technique is if you have a more open compost system, you can actually turn the whole pile, what we call like fluffing it up. By fluffing it up, you're adding that air manually by like digging with a shovel or kind of turning your whole compost bin. We'll get into some of the different types of bins, but like turning the compost bin will then add air into those pockets that might not already exist. But you want to make sure you're keeping it aerated. You can tell if it's not aerated because your compost will start to slow down a little bit or you can start to smell it a little bit more. So you want to make sure then you're using that fluffing it up or starting to add those layers. Questions about that? Yeah?
Can you use shredded like mail? If you just shred your mail and stuff, can you compost that?
You just want to be careful because sometimes like your mail has that little plastic thing so you can see inside it. Do you know what I'm talking about? So you want to be careful to keep out some of those parts. But other types of junk mail, like if you get catalogs or coupons or something like that, that's perfectly good compost. You can shred it and add it. So you just want to make sure you're only putting in the paper products though, keeping out plastic, even things like staples can be in your mail. But yeah, you can totally use mail as a good aeration system. Other questions? I'm going to go to the back and then you.
Does it have to be shredded?
The shredding just makes it easier and faster to break down. If I were to put in a whole sheet of newspaper, it's going to take a lot longer than if I were to shred that newspaper first, because then the microbes have more options to start breaking it down faster.
I was told at one composting thing I went to not to use the color print from newspapers.
Right. So ink is not a best composter, especially like receipt ink has like chemicals in it that you probably shouldn't add to your compost. But if you're adding newspaper ink kind of degrades pretty quickly. But if you're having like a high quality glossy ink, you probably want to avoid putting that into your compost. But things like newspaper and cardboard that aren't that super glossy, that might just have a little bit of ink, is generally okay to use in your compost.
You only shred a couple times a year in Greenbelt. So you have to do your own shredding.
Even if it's just a manual tearing it up a little bit, that's even better than just putting in a whole sheet of newspaper. So if you don't have access to a shredder, it's harder for you. You can just manually tear up those newspapers or those pieces of paper to break them down for you.
About how much paper?
I mean, it kind of depends on your bulk waste that you're creating, but if you're having like a layer of paper and then a layer of waste and then a layer of paper, so it kind of depends on the size of your compost and the size of the waste that you're generating. But I would we'll get into the balance of the different types of the food that we're adding. And if you still have a question about it after that, then I will come back to you. Yeah.
With the cardboard, do you need to tear that down?
I would not put a whole sheet of cardboard. I would tear it up a little bit, but you don't have to worry so much because cardboard actually has a pretty aerated system. It's kind of like two really thin sheets with a lot of space in between. So I would avoid putting like a big sheet of cardboard, tear it up a little bit, but you don't have to worry as much as like a big sheet of paper. Any other questions? Cool. Well, this bottom line is you want to either be adding those lasagna layers of these things that have lots of aerated pockets or fluffing it up manually just to make sure that you're aerating your compost. Cool. Do you want to click for me? Thanks. All right, so water, just as important as air is that water is to the microbes to break down your compost. They're a living thing, they need access to water. So you want to make sure that your pile is as moist as a wrung out sponge. So you want to make sure it's not getting too dry, especially in some of those drier summer months. You want to make sure it's not sopping wet, that it has access to good drainage, especially in some of these wetter winter months. But what you can do is just making sure that there's a thin coating of water kind of on every particle, and a good test is just grab a chunk and see if it's about as dry as a wrung out sponge. So in the summer you might need to spray a little bit with some hose, maybe something from your rain barrel, just so that the compost doesn't get too dry. You can tell because it will look like dried out soil, it'll look lighter in color. You want to make sure it looks a little bit darker. And then in the winter months, you just want to make sure that it's in a spot that it has access to drain that excess water, so it's not just pooling underneath and causing an anaerobic system when the water will actually cause there to be no oxygen in the system, and then you're back to that process of aeration. So you just want to make sure that you're having enough water in the drier months and not too much water in the winter months. Is that a question?
Can you talk a little bit about more, or if you're going to show this in the demonstration, that's fine, about what you mean by the drainage? Do you mean like digging something, channel for the water to go out? Or?
I would just not put your compost bin in a place that's like a lower elevation where all the water would pool into, or if you're noticing that like there's some kind of blocking the water. So not necessarily like creating like a system for it, but just noticing those problems in case they come up that it needs proper drainage. Does that help? Perfect. Any other questions? Cool. So yeah, bottom line, you just want to make sure that it's moist enough as that wrung out sponge by adding or making sure there's good draining. All right. Yeah.
So to get the whole pile sort of uniformly moist, that almost implies you do need to do some turning. And, well, just let you respond to that.
Yeah, so kind of thinking about two different systems, there might be more of a pile where you want to be turning it to aerate it anyway, and that way we'll turn over some of the drier parts and mix it with the wetter parts, and you continuously add water. That's the system we have here at Public Works. However, the system that we're selling today is more of like a closed system, so the water will drain through. So you just want to make sure that you're adding enough water that not just the top is wet, but that as it drains through, then the rest of it kind of gets that water as well. And that can even just be natural water with like rainwater or a rain barrel or something. It doesn't need to be extra water.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, any other questions? All right, perfect. Do you mind clicking? Oh yeah.
Sorry.
No problem.
I know that sometimes rain barrel water, like because it's coming off a roof and stuff like that, if you're going to put your compost in your garden,
Yes.
do you want, are any of the pollutants coming off your roof staying in your compost and you're putting it in your garden?
Right. I mean, that's a great question. What's great is that compost is actually a natural filter, and so it will kind of filter out some of those bad toxics from getting into your plants. So it's probably even better for you to use your compost as a filter than just putting that water straight onto the plants. Yeah, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? All right, awesome. All right, now we can click. Thank you. So now we're getting to the food. So this is that breakdown of what we call the browns versus the greens. So you want to make sure that when you're doing compost that it's kind of one of two types of general food for your microbes. And the first one is browns. So this is what I was talking about when we were aerating, are these things that are more dried out and that brown color. For instance, cardboard, shredded newspaper, dried out plants, and then like that autumn leaves that you pull up from the ground, or like wood chips. So things that are kind of really like a denser, drier material that haven't been so recently alive, because this adds a good carbon food for your microbes. So they have a really long cellulose sugar chain, which is food for your microbes. So you want to make sure that this goes into your compost bin. I think a lot of people think compost is like kitchen waste, but you want to make sure that it also has access to some of these brown materials like cardboard and shredded newspaper, because that's the food for the microbes. So in addition to being a good aeration pocket, it's also providing that long sugar chain for your microbes. Well, any questions about that?
Do you use grass clippings?
Yeah, grass clippings is actually what we call a green, which is on the next slide, but of course grass clippings are a great option for your compost. All right, cool. Do you mind clicking? Thank you. So then the opposite of our browns are our greens. So these are things that were really recently alive, things like your kitchen waste, your grass clippings, your garden clippings, maybe some like coffee grounds or tea bags, things that have that green color and like a good like a moisture texture because they are high in nitrogen content. So while we had our carbon from our browns, the greens provide that nitrogen, which are the building blocks of proteins or amino acids. So they're also essential for your microbes. So you want to make sure that you're having about equal parts between these like kitchen waste and your yard waste, and then the cardboard, wood chips, newspaper, because that C to N ratio, keeping it about a balanced 50-50 is like really good for your microbes. So kind of if you put in a layer of that, those browns, not only does that add aeration, but then you'll add a layer of the greens on top and keep that 50-50 ratio. So that's why we call it lasagna layers, where you're adding like a layer of the browns, then a layer of the greens, and keep building up from there so you know about the ratio of what you're building in your compost pile. Yeah, question?
I've seen that there's now plastic utensils that say they're compostable. Are they really compostable?
So that's hard for like a residential composter because normally you need a bigger system where you can actually, we'll talk about hot composting where you get it really to like a higher temperature and you're providing a lot more mechanical labor. So for a garden composter, it's probably not the best idea. I'm sure if it's made with biodegradable parts that it eventually would compost, but especially for residential cold composters, we suggest that you would send that to like a mom's so that it can get into that bigger mechanical process. Yeah.
What about eggshells?
Eggshells are a perfect example of a green. We'll get into like some more specifics, but it's a great kitchen waste that you can throw into your compost. It will decompose pretty quickly. Other questions? All right, awesome. Do you mind clicking for me? Thank you. So then just to go over kind of everything as a review, you as the composter are providing your food, both the browns and the greens, in addition to the air through the aeration process and your water. And then you're providing that habitat for your microorganisms, your bacteria, your bugs. Then we'll turn all of that into good compost. So you as the composter are just making sure you're adding the right ingredients to get that good compost out. Cool. Questions about that? Perfect. Rolling right along. Do you want to click for me? Thanks. So now we'll kind of break down just a little more specifically what is good to compost, kind of the do's and the don'ts. So on the do's side for our greens, you definitely want to use those like fruit and vegetable peels, bananas, avocados, peppers, whatever you're cooking in the kitchen. Those peels are great greens. In addition, eggshells is a great thing you can use. Coffee grounds, tea bags, grass clippings, garden clippings, houseplant trimmings, whatever kind of greens that you can add from that. Good browns are our autumn leaves, wood chips, shredded newspaper, cardboards. It has on here dried weeds. We're going to get into a second about maybe a little bit of a stipulation, but if you can ensure that your weeds have not gone to seed yet and are very, very dry, so they're not still alive, that can be a brown that you can add, but I'll get into a little more detail about that on our next slide. Some of the don'ts, some things that you probably want to avoid are your meats, fats, and dairy products. They will compost eventually, however it takes a little bit longer, and they can, especially if they're outside, attract unwanted pests. Some of our rodents will kind of use the smell to attract that. So probably want to avoid your oils, your butters, your cheeses and milks, and then like big meats and bones. And if you have a little bit, like, oh, I have a couple chicken bones or like just a little bit of cheese, you probably could throw it in there. But if you're putting like a turkey carcass after Thanksgiving or something like that, that's going to bring those rodents that you probably want to avoid. It's just going to take a lot longer to break down. So that's just something probably to avoid as like a cold composting residential composter. You and then you.
Wax paper?
Wax paper will eventually break down. Probably, again, that's more so like the utensils. It's going to take a lot longer, especially as a cold compost. So if it is marked compostable, I would probably take that to mom's rather than put it in your own.
Are citrus fruits okay?
Citrus fruits are actually a great example of a green. We're going to get into a different type of composting where citrus probably you want to avoid, but citrus are great. Those orange, lemon peels, awesome compost. Any other questions? All right, perfect. So now we know the do's and the don'ts. Do you mind clicking for me? Thank you. All right, so these are some more examples of things you want to avoid when you're composting. The first one is chemically treated wood, so that's like your pressure treated wood with like the arsenic, the copper. It's those heavy metals that are really bad for your compost you want to avoid putting in there, especially if you're going to use it as a soil additive. So anything with this creosote or the penta preservative, probably want to avoid that. A good way to tell is if it's fresh, it has that green color to it that you can see up in the right hand corner there. Want to avoid it. If it's older brown wood and you can't tell, it would be probably just best to avoid it, especially if it's a big piece. So yeah, chemically treated wood, definitely avoid that in your compost. So diseased plants, an example is that picture over there. The disease can actually persist through the compost, and then that's a really bad soil additive. Any plants that grow in there will be exposed to that disease. So you're going to want to landfill that, send that to like your normal curbside trash pickup or the yard waste pickup. You don't want to send it into your compost. So then we were talking about our pernaceous or our noxic weeds. On the last slide, we said like a dried seed or dried weed that has not gone to seed. A stipulation with that is that if you have those seeds present, they will actually most likely survive your compost, and then you add that as a soil additive, and the weeds are going to come right back up. So these are things like your morning glories or your sorrels, your bamboos, your ivies, things that are kind of those invasives, exotics that we're like talking about and how we have to have maintenance with that. So if you're pulling them down as maintenance, you most likely want to send that to the landfill or the yard waste on the curbside. You don't want to compost that. If you are an experienced composter where you think you can tell what has gone to seed and what has not, and you've dried it out to the point that you're sure that it's dead, you probably could use it as a brown, but especially if you're a little bit more of a layman with composter or a beginner composter, you probably just want to avoid most of your weeds and just send them to the landfill. And then the last things are human and our pet waste. They just contain some diseases that can persist and then cause like your pets or your family to actually get sick. So especially if it's closer to your house. So you probably want to just avoid those human and pet waste. If you're, again, an experienced composter with hot composting, which I'll get to in a couple slides, you might be able to add it, but I would just suggest as a cold composter, don't use it at all. Cool. So any questions about like the what to avoid when composting? Awesome, you guys are pros. Do you mind clicking for me? Thank you. So then here's just a review of our goods on this side. We have like our greens and our browns, our plants, yard clippings, newspaper, cardboard, eggshells. But then on the outside, we don't want to have any of our meat or our dairy or our bones, our weeds. And then people might possibly get confused between recycle and compost. You want to make sure you're not putting like cans or glass in there. That will not compost, so just send that to your curbside recycling. And then kitty litter is just not a good option. It's chemically treated, so you just want to not send that to your compost or other kind of pet wastes. So good review, what to go in, what to avoid. All right, do you mind clicking? Oh, your question.
It's gonna be a weird question.
No.
What about like wine that has gone bad? Can you just pour that in?
I think, yeah, that would be something to compost. Again, like you want to make sure that it's adding moisture, so probably wouldn't supplement water in any way, but if you just have wine that you're not going to drink, it's organic, it's water, so you can probably add that to your compost. Yeah?
You store with apple core, doesn't that contain seeds?
So the seeds will most likely not grow, they'll actually break down. So things like avocado pits or like apple seeds, they're like lower in number, so they're not necessarily gonna grow. Now if you have like a bunch of pumpkin seeds or something like that, you might just wanna send that to like a mom's for that mechanical kind of breakdown process. Because those pumpkin seeds, there's so many of them, there's hundreds of them, they could actually sprout, but just a couple apple seeds or like an avocado pit or something, probably not too worried about it.
Avocado pit is okay too?
Yeah, and would probably break down. And then if you notice an avocado starting to grow in your compost, you just pull that out and then compost the parts. Any other questions? All right, cool. Do you mind clicking for me? Thank you. Such a good volunteer. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of compost bins or compost systems that we have. So just as a general rule of thumb, the ideal compost like pile or compost bin size is about a cubic yard, so that's at like 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. What's good is anyone who's buying compost bin today that actually fits that perfectly, so it'll be about a cubic yard. If you're going for a hot compost, which we'll get into in a couple of slides, you're going to want to make sure it's actually 1.5 meters, so just a little bit even bigger, because it's going to need more space and more volume to actually heat up as a hot composter. But the cold compost can be about a cubic yard in size. And then there's a whole range of different styles or systems that you can go for, and I'm going to break them down over the next couple slides. But just thinking about your own needs and your own style and like what you're looking for. Think about the space that you have for this compost bin, where it's going to be located in your yard or your garden or your shed, and then kind of use it for more of a 1 bin, more of 3 bins. What is the aesthetic that you're going for in your garden? How much waste do you actually create? Like a family of 1 versus a family of 5 are going to have 2 totally different waste levels. So kind of just keeping all of that in mind as considerations as I'm going through some of these next slides and talking about the different types of bins and styles and systems can just be really helpful for you to think about what works best for your life and what kind of composter you're going to be. Cool. Do you mind clicking for me? All right, so just before we even get into that, the question, can we compost here in Greenbelt? And the answer is wholeheartedly yes. So GHI members can actually compost. You just want to make sure that if it's super large, so bigger than a 6 foot by 6 foot, or more than 1 bin, so we're going to get into some multi-bin systems here, that you're actually just going to request permission and get some technical assistance from the GHI staff. But it is encouraged for GHI members to compost. Same with City of Greenbelt. There's just a couple stipulations. You just want to make sure that it's a contained bin. You don't just have a giant pile of compost in your yard. And that you're avoiding wooden structures as part of it. So if you have a wooden fence in your yard and you're trying to like fence it in to keep it, or like a tree or something, the only problem with that is that the wood will start to decompose if not properly managed. So you just want to make sure that any of the physical structures you're using to contain that compost isn't like a wooden structure from the city. But other than that, the City of Greenbelt is wholeheartedly saying compost. It's a great way to preserve your soil. It's a great way to help the environment. And then Prince George's County also says yay for composting. So you have 3 levels. As long as you have a couple stipulations and make sure you're not doing it in a damaging way, then all 3 levels say are a go for composting. Cool. Questions about that? All right, perfect. Do you mind clicking for me? Thank you. So then this is just an example of some of our post and wire fencing or our lumber pallets. So you can see that a compost bin can be pretty simple. I see a lot of these in like the gardens around Greenbelt. So just 4 posts covered with like a chicken wire for that really kind of like a low maintenance creation of a compost bin. So that is really helpful because it's quite aerated. There's air coming at it from all sides. And then what they normally do is there's like a door right here that like has a hinge to open so that you can pull off compost from the bottom and keep making compost on top, or kind of turn it if you're concerned about aeration. So that's a really like a low maintenance, lower budget way to build a composter. We also have lumber pallets. You just want to make sure it's not treated wood when you're doing this. And it's basically just kind of a contained bin. This also provides a lot of space for aeration. Just making sure that it's not a pile in your yard. You can just put it in these lumber pallets. Again, just want to make sure that the decomposition doesn't start to affect the pallets. So if you're having compost in the middle, you just want to make sure that it's not kind of getting onto the sides and allowing those microbes to break down. So this might need a little bit more maintenance over time just to avoid that decomposition. But these are 2 really kind of examples of like lower budget, kind of maybe reuse materials to create your compost bin. Cool. Do you mind clicking? Thanks. So a compost bin, which is an enclosure that can be purchased, these are the ones that we actually have for sale. So what's helpful about this is it's a nice contained structure that looks pretty aesthetically pleasing, that can go kind of anywhere in your yard. What's great about this is it has a lid on top that you can pull off to add your compost on the top, and then a door down here which you can open. As you're adding compost throughout the middle, it'll start to decompose as it gets towards the bottom because it's been in there longer, and then you can pull out your good fresh compost from the bottom here. There's also some vents for aeration on the side, but the only kind of thing you have to remember with one of these is that it's harder to like aerate it if you're gonna like fluff it up. So this is really important to do those lasagna layers where you're adding those cardboard and shredded newspaper so that it actually has proper aeration throughout. Yeah?
So can the helpful bugs, et cetera, survive in a closed bin like that?
Yeah, it's perfect for them as long as you're adding that layers for aeration and you're adding water and fresh food. They will create happy compost in the system.
So you have to turn it inside or you don't?
You probably don't want to actually do any kind of turning for aeration. The creation of those lasagna layers for the pockets of air, and these vents will kind of do the best kind of type of aeration for these closed systems.
Will it stay hot enough that during the winter it won't freeze?
Yeah, so you probably want to keep it in a place that's not like super exposed, but it will survive most of like a frost or like heavy snows and everything, and it will keep doing its job.
So if you put it in your garage, even though the garage is cold,
You probably can even just keep it
just-
outside, and it will do a good job. That's why it's a bit more durable. They will not kind of have any problems with frost or snow or ice or anything like that. So you can even keep it outside during the winter, and it'll keep doing a good job.
and the content will not freeze or anything. You can keep it outside.
No, it will kind of stay hot enough with all the work that's going on inside. Did you have something to add, Erin?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you probably don't want to put it inside your garage because your garage floor won't have good drainage. So you want to keep it outside. Our compost system here actually steams in the winter. It stays so hot. So that'll probably happen with these bins as well. It stays so warm that in our cold winters, it'll survive through that, and you'll be able to see the steam from the heat.
Yeah. So if you think about like normal soil can take a winter covering, so the compost should also do a good job. And then I know you first, then here.
Okay. If you're using cardboard,
Mhm.
should you cut it up in small pieces or leave it more up?
Yeah, you don't want to put in a giant piece of cardboard. Definitely breaking it up into smaller pieces so they'll decompose a little bit faster. It really helps out. Oh, sorry, I saw your hand first.
So I know we'll see this eventually, but is it perforated on the bottom or has the drainage done from the bottom?
It's actually just kind of open on the
It's
bottom.
open,
Yeah,
okay.
so then it will percolate into the ground.
Okay.
And then I saw your hand.
Is it, and you may get to this later, but locating it, I remember locating it in sun is a good idea so that it will stay hotter, including in winter.
Right. Yeah, so you probably don't want to put it in shade, especially in the winter. The sun really just helps, but partial shade is okay. You don't necessarily have to be in the sun. It's not growing anything, but it helps out, especially like on a cold day like this, to heat up a little bit more. And then you had a question.
Yeah, is there, when you put it down, should you do anything to the earth before you, like till it up or?
Nope.
Nope, just.
No, it can be good to go. If your ground is especially dense or like clay soil or something and you're concerned about drainage, then you could do something, but generally most areas around here it's pretty good just to set down on the ground. I saw your hand and then you.
So we have one of these bins and it's great and we love it. We think we have some problems with raccoons or squirrels who are probably the raccoons. They're very good at getting that bottom
This part
door
open.
off and putting in the stuff. So we've taken to like trying to put rocks on top of that. Or if you have any tips for how to keep the little boogers out of there, that would be great.
Are you putting meats or dairies in your compost?
No.
Well, raccoons really shouldn't be vegetarian, but
Really anything.
yeah, possibly if you put like a lawn chair in front of it or something. I know other people have done that. Maybe you can try a bungee cord, but you do want to make it accessible for you as a human. So.
I've tried a bungee cord. I'm not sure it has like a place where you can.
We
could go around.
Yeah, I think people do bungee cord around
Yeah.
and have a clip in the front. All right, so I saw your hand and then your hand.
I got 2 of the bins, and
Mhm.
I put chicken wire down on the ground before I put the bin on it, because it said that would help keep,
It contained, right?
yeah.
So yeah, that can be something to do if
Maybe
you're
the raccoons, if they ran into the chicken wire.
maybe. So that's an option.
It said for squirrels and stuff.
Yeah. So that's a good option if you're concerned about it splaying or pests or something. You can use chicken wire. It's a great tip.
So since it's open on the bottom, that would seem to suggest it's really important to find your final location first. It's not
Yeah.
easy to move it around,
Yeah,
especially
and-
once it starts filling up.
No, exactly. So you probably want to kind of find what's the best
Really
location
think
for
it
you.
through where you're going to put it.
Yeah, definitely have all those considerations. And you can move it before you start using it once you place it, but once you start using it, you probably want it, that's your final spot.
Should you ever just mess it all up, just mix the whole bunch? Or because that would take you away from the layer. But that's what I've done. I've got
Mhm.
just a big pile of stuff, and I just wondered if it would be helpful to just,
I mean, definitely,
fork or
if you're
something.
concerned about aeration or you just want to kind of mix that all up, there's not a problem for doing that. What you miss out on is any good compost at the bottom that you were just about to use and is mixed with stuff that's from the top. So then the whole process might just take a little longer, but if you're not concerned about the speed or anything like that, it can definitely, it's not a problem to mix it up.
We have 3 bins, and it's a community project.
Mhm.
Should we designate them as new, so that we have an idea of what is being composted and is older, or just?
So there's an option as a 3-bin system, we'll get to in a second, where you would do that. It's not necessary by any means.
We have that one.
Yeah, if you get, and what
Okay.
a 3-bin system means is that you put all your new waste in one.
Right.
When it's more decomposed, you add it to the second one, and then when it's closer to being compost, you add it to the third one.
Right.
Especially as a community bin, that can be really hard to like regulate and create rules with that. So there's not a need for creating that 3-bin system. It's just knowing that it might take a little bit longer to get to that good spot of compost, but if speed's not a requirement, especially for a community bin, it's not a problem to kind of keep them all the same.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you're pulling out the compost, and using that, is it gonna contain like bugs, or is it just the dirt and the bugs kind of stay up in their top?
So it will have some bugs in it. What's good is that the bugs are kind of throughout, especially microbes. You can't even see them. They're present throughout all of it. But if you take it out, there might be some earthworms, there might be some other kinds of those bugs in there, which will go into the soil, but then they're also great for the soil. So don't worry about like attracting bugs or making sure there's bugs left or anything like that. Nature does its work of providing those little workers for you. So you totally don't have to worry about like, oh, I just took out all my bugs. Now what? Or like, oh, do I have to leave bugs or anything like that?
Well,
like,
when I tried to do it before, I got a bunch of maggots, so I just
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't doing it right.
Yeah, I mean, just making sure that like it's properly aerated and everything to avoid that. But definitely, like, don't worry about the bugs at any point. They'll do their job. Do you have a question?
I had a similar thing where I had flies in a barrel composter. Like, maybe again, this is later in your presentation, but if that does happen, sort of how do you kind of get back and recover from it would be helpful to know.
It's a good question. I think definitely this is nice because it's a sealed system, and then having those layers where you're having the browns that the flies aren't necessarily attracted to with the greens might be a different way to kind of combat it. I personally don't have any experience with that, so I'm trying to come up with possibly an idea, but I can look up some tips and email it out to you if you want to find me afterwards. Yeah, or if anyone else has had experience with that and knows something, we can definitely share with you. Do you have something to share?
Just turn it and the flies disappear, top layer.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
Did you?
Yeah, I had a barrel, and so we would turn it. I think we had it was more that we had the ratios wrong.
Okay. Yeah, but a good tip is if you can turn it, then that puts that newer, fresher stuff at the bottom.
Right, it would help, but yeah.
But if you had a lot of greens and not a lot of browns to kind of balance it, that can be one of the problems that you encounter is getting more of those flies in there because they love the greens but not necessarily the browns.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, you can kind of cover up that smell a little bit if you just add some extra leaves. Every
browns.
time that you put your greens, just kind of get in the habit of adding some browns
Yes.
too to mask that smell so that they're not as attractive.
Nice. Thank you.
This goes back to, again, we have a community, so some of our concerns are going to be a little different. But they treat the lawn early in the spring. And so like this time of year now, and they've done the final cuttings, etc. Can we still put the greens in? They haven't treated again, so it's just they treat early in the spring.
Are you talking about like an herbicidal treatment?
I don't know what it is. They just put the little flags out, don't walk, don't eat, don't.
I wouldn't
near
be
animals.
too concerned. They should be using small enough amounts, especially when it dilutes when it rains, that you should still be able to use that as a green. I wouldn't be too concerned about that. If you do notice some problems or something like that, definitely contact us and we'll try and work through that. But I think even treated grass clippings, as long as you're not using them like right as it's treated, should be fine. Like especially over a season later when the rain has diluted that a lot, I think it should be okay.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah.
You got it at a yard sale, like a drum, cylinder composter or anything
Yep.
to know, or kind of tips on how to use that best?
I mean, again, that's more of a closed system, so you just want to make sure that it has that proper aeration, but that's really helpful because you can turn it to aerate it and to mix it all up. I guess the only consideration is you're not building those layers, so you just want to make sure you're keeping the C to the N, the brown to the green ratio pretty consistent, because it's harder to tell without the layers. But as long as you get in the habit of adding some greens and adding some browns, I think generally it should be pretty good. Did you have specific questions?
How often would you recommend turning it?
Kind of, I mean, it depends on a couple environmental factors. I bet once a week would be okay, or even if you just get in the habit of adding something and then turning it. There's not really a prescribed measure because it depends a lot on what waste you're adding, how wet it is during the time, but about a week shouldn't be a bad system. Any other questions? All right, cool. Do you want to click for us? Almost there. So this is just a diagram looking at when you're adding the compost and it gets towards the bottom is when it becomes that really like that good compost, but at the top it's still waste. So this is just an example of the wire mesh that you want to have a door to pull out the stuff from the bottom to use as that soil supplement, and then the stuff in the middle will go back onto it to keep doing its job. So you just want to make sure that if there's a layering system, you know that you can pull out stuff from the bottom, which is why the closed bin with the door is really helpful. Cool. Do you want to click? Oh, question.
Yeah, when you first start, how long until there's something useful, or does it depend on what you're putting in?
It depends. There's a lot of factors. It depends on what you're putting in, the moisture, the temperature outside. Again, like kind of what bugs are there and present before they get attracted and everything. So I don't even have an estimate because there's so many factors, but you'll know when it's good compost, that there's a good way to tell. And we'll get into that in a couple slides.
You're going to cover vermiculture, but would you recommend putting in worms into your compost?
If it's the right species of worms, even grabbing earthworms doesn't do much, but there's different types of worms. We'll get into that in another slide. It can help out. It's just a couple different considerations for vermiculture.
Does it help if you take your kitchen waste and chop it in smaller pieces before you put it in? Does it make a difference?
It does a little bit because then the microbes can get at it quicker. So if you want to get your compost a little bit faster, chopping it up can be a good process. But not necessary by any means. If you're just like, I just want to put it in there, it will break down eventually. All right, cool. Do you mind clicking for us? So good at this. Get a round of applause at the end. So then this is just an example of a 3-bin system, kind of what I talked about earlier, where you're putting in the waste to the first one as that fresh waste. It still has a lot of decomposing to do. As it starts to break down a little bit, you can put it into the intermediary bin, where it's a little bit more composted, a little bit more biodegraded. And then right before it's that good compost, where it's like almost ready to use, you can put it into the 3rd bin. So we have like a 2-bin system here at Public Works, so you can get to see an example of that. But this just helps to kind of compartmentalize it, and so that instead of pulling it from the bottom, you can actually just pull it from its own bin. Something else that's a consideration, definitely for a more experienced composter, is called hot compost. And so what this is you're actually just changing the ratio of your browns and your greens, or your C's to your N's, to up a little bit more on the nitrogen. And then creating a little bit of a bigger space. So what happens with hot composting is you're actually getting up to closer to like 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and it breaks down the compost a lot faster. So if you are more experienced with your cold composting, you want to experiment with hot composting, there's a lot of good information out there that you can kind of look at for exactly what kind of ratios you need to build and what kind of space and volume requirements that you have. But if you are doing that, it's going to break down your compost a lot faster. And you can add a couple other things to it that will then, the heat will break them down. Cool. Questions about that? All right, awesome. Someone want to click for me? Thanks. So then vermicomposting, or using worms in your compost, is just a little bit of a different process. So what you're doing is actually just building one of these enclosures here, and adding one of these species of worms. They're called like red worms or red wigglers. And you can order them online, they're pretty cheap. And what happens is they'll actually break down your food in like a different way than the microbes do, so that you're just building one of these systems with some good aeration on the top, and keeping it like this, which is just kind of a protection. But we have an example in the back there, so after the presentation, feel free to come check them out. The worms are really easy to use. The only consideration is you don't want to add, of course, meats or dairies or anything like that. Also, garlic, onion, and citrus can be bad for the worms. They just won't eat it. So you just want to make sure, but any other kind of greens or browns besides those are really good for the worms, and they'll help break down your compost, reduce the smell, and they'll do their work. You can even keep this one inside. I know here at Public Works we keep it inside our office, so definitely good like inside composting that you can consider. Especially though if you have a lot of waste, probably not the best, but if you're just adding a couple kitchen scraps and some newspaper every once in a while, this can be a really awesome option for you. Cool. Questions about that? All right.
I want to point out if we have any teachers in the room, it would be great as a demonstration for your students too. So if you want to learn how to build it, we'd be happy to give you more information on that.
Yep. So also classrooms are a great option for this. All right, cool. All right, we're almost there. Someone want to click for me? Thanks. All right, so then this is getting at to when you know your compost is ready. So usually this will be at the bottom of your system or a multi-bin system, like all the way to like one side or the other. But you'll know because it's really dark in color and that there will not be any of the parts that are recognizable. So there's not just going to be some eggshells or some newspaper or some like plant parts in there. It'll look almost like soil and it has that really earthy smell to it. It almost looks like if you have those soil additives from like Lowe's or Home Depot and you open up the bag, it looks a lot like that. It smells a lot like that. Has a really dark, rich color to it. So that's how you know when you're achieving good compost, is when you can have this look and this smell and that you can't see any of the parts in it. If you're curious about whether it's like still decomposing or if it's reached its kind of like maximum potential, we have like a Ziploc bag test where you can take a portion of it and put it in a Ziploc bag and seal it for a week and then open it up and smell it again. And then when it still has that really earthy smell, then you know, okay, this is good, it's reached its maximum potential, it's good compost. If it still smells like something's decomposing in there, it still has a little bit of that like I don't want to say putrid, but like a little bit of a decomposing smell, then you know it just needs a little bit more time and it still can reach its maximum potential still. Cool. Questions about that? All right, awesome. Next slide. Thanks. Just as a quick reminder that composting is actually really great for the environment for a couple of different reasons. The first is it's reducing the amount of volume that's sent to the landfill by 30% or more, which is pretty huge. A lot of the waste that we don't even think about is like food scraps or food waste or yard scraps that can go back into compost. So if you're reducing that by 30% or more, that's so much less space in the landfill, which is great because landfills take up so much space, are pretty expensive. You can see it's like $59 per ton of landfill, as well as they can cause lots of health-related issues or biodiversity-related issues just to build a landfill. So any kind of part that you can do to like reduce that amount of waste is huge for an environmental impact. Additionally, compost holds a lot of water, so it's kind of like a spongy material. It holds 20 times its own weight in water. And that is also a really good filtration system. So as you're adding it to the soil, it prevents soil erosion, can be a good soil additive to kind of help with that, as well as will filter out a lot of those pollutants. I know we've had a question about like rooftop pollutants, but if you're adding that to the soil, it will actually lower the watershed contamination by absorbing some of those toxics or absorbing some of that sediment to help our watersheds. And then lastly, it actually mitigates climate change to compost. You're reducing the amount of food waste in the landfill, which produces methane when it's at the landfill, when it breaks down, which is a greenhouse gas. So when you're composting, you're reducing the amount of methane in the atmosphere, as well as composted like earth, if you're like using it as a lawn supplement or in your garden, will actually increase the availability for plants to sequester CO2. So you're also helping to mitigate climate change when you're being a good composter. So, awesome reasons to keep composting. All right, we're almost there. Well, a couple more slides. Thanks. So composting is great for your garden. You can use it as a soil amendment before you plant. You can kind of dig it into the soil and it will create a good material that we were talking about with filtration and water storage. You can also just use it as a top dressing, whether that's in your garden, on your lawn, in your house plants, and it will create a lot of good benefits just to use it as a top dressing as well. Cool. All right, I think we have like just 2 more slides. Almost there. Thank you. So your compost is good for the soil because it adds a lot of that organic matter, which is crucial for your plants to grow. So all of that waste that you just had is adding organic matter back into the soil, as well as it improves the way the water interacts with the soil. So it's a really good spongy system. So soils that are sandy, where they need to retain more like water, it will be a good addition because it's adding that water-containing components. But more clayey soils, where it might have a problem with drainage, the compost will help you drain it. So all soil types are benefited by compost. There's really no downside to using compost in your soil. As well as it has like beneficial microbes in it. So the microbes the bugs that are in your compost are great for plants. Plants have a good symbiotic relationship with them, and they will have good nutrient, kind of like passing nutrients into the plants just by adding that compost. So it's really helping like in a bunch of different ways to amend and preserve our soils and keep it local, to keep that closed loop with the waste cycle. All right, questions about that? Yeah?
So, I mean, the compost looks a lot like soil.
Yes.
So what's in soil that's not in composting? Like, what's the difference?
Minerals are in soil, so we have lots of like different irons, or calcium is actually also present. So basically compost is humus. If you've ever done any kind of soil, there's the organic matter and then there's minerals. So you're adding back the organic matter into soil to kind of preserve that. It's especially good to keep out erosion.
So we have a lot of problems in our area in GHI because of the huge trees.
Mm-hmm.
It sucks everything out of the yard, so you really have a hard time growing grass in
Right.
some areas.
Mm-hmm.
So would this help with getting the grass to grow? in the
Possibly.
areas?
This is a great addition of organic matter and those good beneficial microbes. So if you're having a problem because the trees are sucking out a lot of that organic matter, a supplement like this could kind of possibly help that. Again, there could be other issues with that, so I don't want to promise, like, add compost, grass will grow, I promise, but it could be one
We
of...
have the clay soil too. So
Right, so this, it will be a good addition to the soil, but it could possibly help with grass growing as well. Any other questions? All right, cool. I think we have like 2 more slides, I think. Yep, that was it. All right, so thank you everyone. Any last questions about the presentation? Yeah.
Sorry. What about like cereal boxes and the boxes from frozen foods that have that kind of weird waxy?
Yeah, just because they're like covered in ink and they have that waxy, it can be really hard to break that down. It will break down. It won't be a problem for your compost. It'll just take a lot longer. So if you have other types of cardboard or newspaper for your browns, it might be a better addition, and you can
like
curbside recycle it, or moms. But it wouldn't be a problem to compost it. It will just take a lot longer. Yeah.
Can you give us a cycle, if we're composting now, will this be ready in the spring?
So there's a lot of factors to it, but it generally, over a season, it'll be ready pretty quickly, but it depends a lot on the waste that's going in, as well as making sure it's properly aerated and with water and the temperature. But generally, if you're composting now, within 6 months' time, it will be ready. Any other questions?
Is there a good rule of thumb on the thickness of the lasagna layers between, say, the layers of cardboard or newspaper or whatever? With the browns and the greens in between.
Right. Is there like, so you're talking about like how much of a layer you're adding?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of that depends on how much waste you're just generating. So as long as you're keeping it balanced, there shouldn't be too much of an issue. It's more so about how big your bin is. You don't want to add so many layers that you're overflowing your bin or anything like that. But again, generally, the amount of waste that you're producing, as long as you're keeping it in good ratio, there's not like a size requirement. I would just be careful about like too many greens and not enough browns, or vice versa. But I don't think size is too much of an issue.
So if you're a family of one that does a lot of reading,
Mhm.
probably are going to have too much paper and not really enough organic.
Yeah, I mean, it can be hard. So something that can really help out is we have, if you see over here, it's hard to see, it's behind the coffee machine. We have a little enclosure to keep kind of kitchen waste. So something I do at my house, because I'm a family of one, is you can keep your greens in this system, and it's nice and close so it doesn't smell and it doesn't really start to decompose yet until you build up enough greens to build up for your browns too. So yeah, I can pull it out really quick, but you can see. Something like this, they're pretty cheap. They have like a lid to it, so you can keep your greens in here until you have enough to with your browns. Luisa, do you have something to add?
Your paper, you can just recycle in your blue bin.
Oh, I do that all the time.
Yeah, so you don't have to compost all of it.
Yeah. So then if you're just producing a little bit of green, you can just add a little bit of brown too, or like build up your greens until you have enough and recycle the browns.
Where did you
Yeah,
get
do you
it?
sell those?
We don't sell them. They're available online pretty cheap. I don't know where we got this one from Public Works, but
You know where.
But you could just use like a Rubbermaid.
yeah, you can use anything else. You just want to make sure it has a good seal on it so it doesn't let bugs in or anything like that. But yeah, anything with a lid can just be used as a composter.
I have a question. What's a red wiggler kind of compost? Is that any faster to be able to use it than like the regular?
It still takes about the same amount of time, but it's more for like if you have an indoor composter, that's a really good option for it. But yeah, it still takes about the same time. Any other questions? Yeah.
Pizza box that has sometimes the oil.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all right?
Yep. I mean, it's pretty big, so you want to make sure you're breaking it down into smaller pieces to compost, but that can be a great brown addition, and it's no problem that it has the oil on it. All right. Any other questions? And of course, if you want to grab me afterwards, it's not a problem at all. Yeah.
When you talk about breaking down the cardboard, you're talking about like the size of your palm, or like how
I'd say that's a pretty good rule of thumb. The smaller you get it, the less work the microbes have. So you putting in that mechanical labor will help them out. But if you were to even put a whole pizza box in a composter, it would break down eventually. So you tearing it up is just helping them out and helping the process go faster.
Interspecies collaboration.
Exactly. Symbiosis. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, that's
Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.